Welcome to these podcasts called Creating the World We Want to Live in. They are based on the science of well-being, incorporating evidence from both positive and community psychology. We explore a wide range of issues from education to economics to the environment and many in between. Our overall message is that for the world to flourish in the future, we need to move from short-term thinking to longer-term thinking and away from a focus on what is good just for me to what is in the interests of most, if not all of us. This podcast is about the education chapter. Our children spend many years in school, and what happens there influences how young people see themselves, other people, and the world around them. I'm Sue Roffey, I'm the author of this chapter, and in this podcast, Professor Pilleltensky is going to ask me more about what it says and why.
I'm thinking as a community psychologist, how do we start to offer an alternative culture to children where we promote caring for yourself and kindness to others, where we promote not just wellness, but also fairness, where your well-being and your freedom is balanced or counterbalanced by the freedom and well-being of other people. And it seems to me that nothing short of that kind of counter-revolution, where people get into small groups and they say, we have a declaration of principles, and this is what we are proposing, which really leads me to your vision of education, that needs to change not only what kids are taught, but how they are taught, and the role of parents, because there is only so much we can change society by educating children if parents don't change. So you use in your education chapter the UNESCO Framework for Learning, which I think is very, very useful. So I wonder if you can expand a little bit on the UNESCO Framework for Learning and how it can be applied not only to kids, but also to parents.
The pillars of learning in that framework are learning to know and learning to do. And in terms of knowledge, we have developed in the last 100 or so years things that prior to that would be in the realms of magic and miracles. The internet, space travel, the genome project, those things. So we've done very well on knowledge and skills. Learning to do is skills. How do we apply all of that? But the other pillars of learning, learning to be and learning to live together and how to transform oneself and society, have been completely sidelined by many of our education systems to their detriment. Now, the social and emotional learning that I have been engaged with, and I call it a tool for well-being across a whole school. And I have been working in many different countries, most recently in a group of schools in China. And we've just finished a trainer program. I've been online with a group from those schools for 12 sessions. And one of the things that people are saying is that learning about how to be and how to live together by having discussions, playing games, doing activities, having reflections, has not only changed the way the young people are behaving towards each other and how they see themselves, but there's also changing me. The teachers who've been doing that have been reflecting on their own learning. And I did some work in University of Western Sydney, which was to run this Circle Solutions in 8 Greater Western Sydney schools. And the young students who were part of that came back and said, this has transformed my life. Why didn't I have this at school? Why didn't I learn these things about to establish a relationship, how to deal with conflict when it arises, how to actually be resilient by thinking slightly differently about everything that I do in the Circle Solutions work that I do is interactive. I don't do anything individually because people learn together. They learn by talking with each other about thinking through things. And the teacher isn't there to say, this is the way you should think, this is what you should do, these are what the rules are. It's giving young people the opportunity to think through scenarios and actually work out for themselves what's fair for everybody, what's the kind thing to do, and why does kindness matter, and how can we make people be safe, and how can we all be responsible for creating a culture in this classroom where everybody feels accepted and safe. And it works. And it's like, how do we get this to expand? Because even the social emotional relationship learning that's happening in some places, in quite a lot of places, quite a bit of it is dictatorial. And we underestimate children. We underestimate children's ability to come to their own conclusions, which are the ones that we would probably like them to come to. But when they are faced with sitting down, doing this, making sure that they get high results, and that's what their teachers want, and that's what their parents want, then we have a problem. And when I do presentations to teachers, I often start by saying, you often get acknowledged for getting high test scores, or perhaps coaching the winning football team, or producing the school play, but you very rarely get acknowledged for turning a child's life around. And teachers can do that.
Yes.
They can do that so long as they have the time and the permission to do so without running ragged, having to be accountable.
I can really relate to the overprivileging, the learning to know and learning to do, and the neglect of the learning to be, learning to live together, and learning to transform oneself and society.
Yes.
So things are out of whack, right? We devote 95% of school time to learning to know and to do, and we give maybe a little bit of time, maybe 5%, I don't know, to learning to be a full human being that will espouse certain values, that will learn about what values are important in life, that learn about balancing wellness with fairness, etc. So you're saying that when you do this work with teachers, they see results.
They do.
And not only in how kids feel, but also I think their academics result improve as well, isn't it?
Well, I was involved in the federal scoping study on approaches to student well-being quite a while ago now. And what we discovered there is that when well-being, positive relationships, the things that we know promote social capital in a school rather than a toxic environment, what we find is that there is better mental health and resilience. There is more pro-social behavior. There are happier teachers, and because students like going to a school where they can be happy, they're more engaged in learning and the results improve. To me, it's an absolute no-brainer. But we have people in our governments, our politicians, who have no idea about child development. They have no idea about how children learn, and they are committed to a set of ideas which I wouldn't even say are not doing children good. I think are actively harming a proportion of our young people as they go into the future. How do we influence or change that political position? Because it's so powerful, because it's these people who we hear on the radio, it's these people who get columns in the newspapers. It's about how do we, as the we, get to have more influence in a counterculture?
For the teachers, the school principals, the managers, the politicians, how can we help them start a process of change? Because the tools are there. I think what you're saying is that the knowledge of how to promote well-being is there. We know what it takes to create a process of reflection, of considering other people's points of view. You talk about your chapter on the roots of empathy, and there are many programs that really demonstrate we have the know-how, how to promote well-being, not just for the child, but for the school and for society at large. And you're talking about the barriers now. The barriers are that politicians are many times clueless about what it takes to promote child development. So I go back to the issue of the counterculture, right? Because I'm thinking, how? I'm sure many people listening to this podcast, this interview, will think about, okay, what do I do now? I mean, Sue and Isaac are telling me that all these social emotional learning programs that they help, there is knowledge. What do I do next? So what would you recommend to the audience listening, saying, I have a child, I have 2 kids at home, and I'm really desperate to do the right thing, or there are teachers who may be listening, and they are probably thinking, none of this is happening in my school. How do I start? What are the baby steps I can take to promote that sort of education? What would you tell them?
Thanks, Isaac. That's a really good question. For a lot of people, for most people probably, change is quite scary. And the bigger the change, the more scary that is likely to be. People like or feel more comfortable with what is familiar. And sometimes even they know that change is needed. They stick with the familiar because it's in the too hard basket to think about doing things differently. So maybe it's a good idea to start with those baby steps, which include looking around for low-hanging fruit. What is easy and quick to do that doesn't take a great deal of effort? When we do the same small things over and over again, they end up being quite big things and making, in the end, significant changes. One of the things that I say quite a bit when I'm talking to teachers about changing school culture is that there are a lot of things that they can't change. Policies that get delivered from above, they can't do very much to change. But we do have control over the words that come out of our mouths. And conversations create culture. So the words that we say in public places to each other is really, really important. Beliefs change when conversations change and culture changes. So as an example of that, if you have somebody in the staff room who says racist things, then getting into a confrontation with them doesn't go anywhere. But just saying that you disagree or see things differently means that that person can no longer believe that everybody else sees things the same way and they have the dominant voice. So you challenge the dominant voice just by saying different things. It's also a good idea to find people in your setting that share the same beliefs and values as you do, or at least to some extent, and do what you can to collaborate with them and think about the small things that you might do, and then maybe gather a bit of a team. And I've seen this happen all over the world with different people who change culture by working together and other people coming on board over time. It's worth thinking about starting maybe with teacher well-being, because teacher and pupil well-being are two sides of the same coin. If you don't take care of teachers' needs and well-being, then they won't have the resources or the interest to just focus on pupil well-being and whole school well-being. So beginning with the staff is not a bad idea. The research on school and student well-being shows us that when well-being is at the heart of a school's endeavours, then behaviour improves, mental health improves, academic outcomes improve. So if you can discover the vision of school leaders, you can then perhaps talk to them about how a well-being approach would meet their vision, would help them achieve their vision and offer them support to do that. School leaders are powerful people, and school change is often led from the top. But when it's led from the top, but engages everybody, so everybody feels that they have a voice, it's much more likely to be sustainable over time. Change takes time, sometimes years. I can remember doing a piece of research where a school principal said to me, when I first came to this school 8 years ago, everybody was awful to everybody else. It was just a terrible place to be. She says, and I was determined that it would become a place where people cared for each other. And she says, after 8 years and almost a nervous breakdown, she said, it's now the school of choice for the local community because people feel that they are wanted, that they're safe, that they can belong, and that they can achieve and make progress. So don't give up when things are difficult and when things don't go well. Keep things under review and keep a record of the changes that are actually happening, because sometimes we focus still on problems and not having achieved what we want to achieve and forget about the things that have already made a big difference. So don't forget what you have done, and that'll give you the resilience to keep going even when things are tough. And finally, I'd just like to say that in the book, at the end of every chapter, we have written a whole list of suggestions for what governments might do, what communities might do, what families might do, what schools might do, so that people don't feel reading our book that there's a bit of a loss. It's full of hope and it's full of potential action. So there's ideas there for everybody, wherever they're sitting, wherever their circumstances.
So you're talking about the values that are implicit in your vision of well-being. So
Yeah.
right now you spoke, for example, about building on strengths and the importance of emotional literacy, talking to kids so that they can identify their feelings. Earlier you spoke about the importance of acceptance. So if I would ask you, what are the top 5, 7 values that you think are really important to instill in the next generation? What would those be?
Okay, that's a hard one. 5. And I'm not sure I can do it in order. But I certainly think that kindness has to be somewhere in the top, right? Kindness to each other, really, really important. Valuing diversity. We are not all the same, and it's really important that we're not all the same. We don't need everybody to be lawyers, bankers, and doctors. We need people who are going to be garbage collectors, and for those people to feel valued for who they are. I think also accepting imperfection. I think that's another one, that nobody's perfect. Another one is getting things into perspective. And that also tunes in with the importance of not just seeing things in the short term, but actually looking about what's important in the longer term. And the value of supportive relationships, healthy relationships with each other.
This is all very, very helpful. So for the audience, if they decide to start the counterculture, they need to be thinking about kindness and diversity and acceptance and thinking about sustainability, really long-term solutions,
yes,
and the importance of supporting relationships. And you have done a lot of work internationally, Sue. I wonder if you have seen communities or countries where this is done in better ways than other places. So can you comment on some countries that, let's say, are more child-friendly, or that they are really serious about promoting the balance between me and we when it comes to well-being?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth saying here that there are pockets of good practice everywhere. There's some wonderful things going on in America. Edutopia is a wonderful organization that is promoting the things that really matter to me in a healthy education. I know that there's some great things going on in schools in Australia, and here and there's everywhere. But I would say that without a doubt, it's the Nordic countries who are probably doing the best. There is less gap between the haves and the have-nots in places like Denmark. There is more trust in their governance. There's more trust in each other. Finland, for instance, they don't start school until about, I'm not sure if it's 6 or 7, but they don't do any formal evaluations, assessments until a child is 17. They keep an eye on how the learning is going, but nobody sits these tests every so many weeks. And that's something to be anxious about. I did a TED talk that reflected the fact that we need an education system that is aligned with healthy child development, that we give children agency, we give them choice in things, we encourage their independence, we foster their relationships with each other, we don't underestimate their ability to think critically, all of those things. When that doesn't happen, you squash their love for learning. When it does happen, they are going to be keen to find out, to discover, to learn, to explore, to research. And that for me is what we need. You know, I watch my little granddaughter learn at 2, explore, experiment, try things out, drop things, throw things. And it worries the living daylights out of me that when she goes to school, that wonderful enthusiasm for finding out will be squashed because she will have to do what the teacher tells her to do. And that really worries me. And I think that that is probably the case for some other parents as well. But I know there's some basics around the fact that we are born to connect. We're born to care for each other. We're born to collaborate. It's part of who we are. It's part of how our brain works, but we have been sidelined into another way of being that is leading us down a pathway of non-well-being, of ill-being. And we need to revisit and rebuild what we know is going to work for most people most of the time and the future of our planet.
So we're coming to the end of our time. So I just wonder if I could just reflect briefly on some of the key points for the audience. And I've heard you talk about the importance of self-determination and agency. Yes. For kids to have opportunities to explore the world, to be creative, to develop mastery in a number of areas. So this is all the learning to do, really, learning to know, but you're also emphasizing learning to be a happy person, learning to be a kind person. And when it comes to learning to live together, how can we collaborate? How can we be empathic to the suffering of others? How can we identify with the struggle of other people and communities? So overall, we're talking about how can I balance not just what's good for me, but also what's good for the community in general. And I also heard you talk about changing not just local practice, which is really important, and for which you've done a lot of work, but also changing policies. And you've spoken about the importance of changing government priorities. It's not just the grassroots efforts, but also it has to be top down, what the government is doing. So for me, the work that your team did with the book, it's all about really what I would call psychosocial well-being. It's not just about the personal, but also about the relational, the familial, the occupational, and the communal. So to conclude, I just want to ask you if there is anything else you want to say to the audience that I haven't had a chance to ask you or for you to say. What are anything else you want to leave with the audience?
I think, first of all, I want to thank people for what they're already doing, because there's a lot of people out there already trying to change things in their own families, in their own communities. And although I think there's an urgency about this, and an increasing urgency about moving from me to we and from the short term to the long term, I also think that we can only do what we can do, and not to dismiss the little things, those little conversations, those ways of helping somebody else, the little random acts of kindness, the way you respond to your children, to acknowledge their feelings, to build their understanding. There are so many little things that everyone can do to foster the we, and all of them are important.
So having read the book, I can attest to the usefulness of the book. And as Sue was saying, at the end of each chapter, there is a section on what can you do? What can schools do? Workplaces, governments? So the book is really full of suggestions and baby steps. So I think it's important for people not to feel overwhelmed.
Yes.
That this is just too much. I don't know how to start a counter-revolution, but what you're saying is there are a lot of little steps people can take today, and those little steps are really important and valuable, and that's how you start. So perhaps our take-home message is you have agency, there is knowledge on what to do, you have to marry your motivation with the knowledge how to do things better. So maybe with this, we're going to wrap it up, and thank you so much, Sue, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. As I mentioned to you, the book made such a strong impression on me that I'm going to use it in my own teaching. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Isaac. Thanks for listening, and for all you are already doing. If you'd like to find out more about what we've been discussing, check out www.creatingtheworldwewanttoLivein.org, where you can also leave comments and queries.